When you think of the Chicago underworld, who do you think of? Al Capone, of course. He was the face of organized crime in America for 100 years. His reign was loud, it was violent, but it was very short-lived. The government made an example of him and he died a broken man. He died of syphilis. But here's what most people don't realize. While Al Capone made the headlines, the man who would really define the Chicago outfit's future was quickly rising through the ranks. His name? Tony Accardo. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't reckless, and unlike Capone, he knew how to survive. For over 4 decades, he controlled the outfit with a quiet authority. He outlasted the feds, he outlasted his enemies, and even the golden era of the American mob itself, when the RICO statute was so destructive. But how did a man who operated in the shadows keep his grip on power for so long? And why, despite his very brutal reputation, did he always seem to be just beyond the government's reach? The truth about Tony Accardo isn't just a crime story. It's a story of control, strategy, and a kind of power that very few people will really ever understand. You know, Chicago is different from New York. While we had our 5 families with their separate territories, and when I say separate territories, it wasn't geographically separated. We just had different areas that we operated in. Chicago was more unified, and no one exemplified this better than the man they called Joe Batters, and that was Tony Accardo. He was born Antonio Leonardo Accardo on April 28, 1906, in Chicago's near west side. His story represents the ultimate evolution from street thug to corporate boss. And yes, he started out on the street. He was a tough guy, no doubt about it, but he became the boss. And you can call it a corporate boss because, you know, organized crime, it's organized, trust me. It doesn't run like corporate America, but it has its own system and its own policies, and it's very organized. Now, he was the son of Sicilian immigrants, Francesco and Maria Accardo, and Tony grew up in a cramped apartment above a storefront on Vernon Park Place. He grew up, you know, very simple, I would say. His family wasn't wealthy. The neighborhood was tough. It was a melting pot of Italian, Irish, and Jewish immigrants, all fighting for the peace of the American dream back then. His father worked as a shoe shiner. He saved every penny he could. But for an ambitious kid like Tony, that legitimate path seemed too slow. It was too uncertain for him. So let me paint you a picture of Chicago in those days. There was the smell of the stockyards. It carried across the city. It mixed with smoke from the steel mills and factories. It was a very blue-collar town. Prohibition was coming, and with it were opportunities that would reshape not just Chicago, but all of America itself. I've said this many, many times. It was the government that made the Mafia Cosa Nostra strong in America when Prohibition came in, no doubt about it. Accardo was perfectly positioned to ride this wave of change. By the age of 14, Accardo, he had already dropped out of school. He was running with a circus gang, they called it, the circus gang. They were a group of neighborhood tough guys who would provide muscle for the bigger operations. These weren't kids playing games. They were the farm team for what would become the Chicago outfit. There was no outfit back then. Remember, these were a bunch of street guys just doing their best to make a living. That's all they were doing. There was no organized crime at that point in time. But what set Tony apart early on wasn't just his toughness. Though he had plenty of that. He was a tough guy, no doubt about it. It was his ability to think ahead, to see the bigger picture. And you know, you can't survive and prosper in that life if you can't think ahead, if you can't see the big picture. He understood that violence was a tool, but it wasn't an end in itself. All of the guys that were really successful, they were anti-violent. It was a tool. It was used when necessary. The guys that always went to violence first, none of them ever lasted. So Tony Accardo understood that. This understanding would serve him well in the decades to come. But let me tell you how Tony Accardo got his famous nickname. It wasn't just handed to him. Believe me, he earned it. The story goes that in 1926, Al Capone himself watched Accardo deal with a group of very disrespectful rival gangsters. He used nothing but a baseball bat. Accardo reportedly hit for the cycle, a brutal display of violence that impressed even Capone. And Capone was a violent guy. From that day on, he was called Joe Batters. But see, what people don't understand is that the nickname wasn't just about violence. It represented something much deeper: reliability, effectiveness, getting things done. When Capone gave you a nickname, and it was Al Capone that gave him that nickname, it wasn't just a name, it was a brand. And Accardo lived up to his brand, you know, very, very well. By the late 1920s, Accardo had become one of Capone's most trusted enforcers. Unlike some of the other muscle, Accardo was always thinking about the bigger picture. He didn't just handle problems, he prevented prevented them from happening in the first place. The thing about the Chicago outfit under Capone, it was a different kind of organization than what most people imagine. And Tony Accardo understood this better than anyone. By 1929, he wasn't just another soldier. Capone had recognized something very special in him. It was a combination of brains, brutality. That combination really set him apart. Now, during the beer wars of the late 1920s, Accardo proved himself not just as an enforcer, but as a very strategic thinker. While others were focused on the immediate fight, Accardo was building relationships with politicians, police, and legitimate businessmen. You know, I can't tell you how well that serves you in that life. Networking. I talk about it all the time. In the street life, it worked. In legitimate life, it works. Networking. You know, one of the reasons that I had success in that life, because I got to know people from the other families. I got to know Chin Gigante. I knew Fat Tony Salerno. I knew a couple of guys that were key guys in some of the other families. And I did some favors for them. I had a car service. I owned a couple of dealerships. If they needed a car, I let them use a car. I sent limousines sometimes to them if they needed to go out somewhere, they needed to get picked up. You know, I was networking in that regard, getting people to, to like me. And it's so important in that life. It's so important in our life now. I tell all my people, networking is key. You got to get to know people. It's important. Well, Tony Accardo understood something very fundamental. Violence might win battles, but relationships might win wars. One particular incident stands out about Tony Accardo. In 1930, when the North Side Gang was making a push into Capone territory, remember, there were a lot of different gangs at that time, Accardo didn't just respond with force. He orchestrated a very complex operation that involved compromising key officials, turning enemy soldiers, and ultimately securing the territory without the kind of bloodshed that brought heat from the papers and, of course, from the police. He engineered a coup in many, many ways. He just knew how to do it. When Capone went down for tax evasion in 1931, the outfit faced its first real crisis of leadership. And this was a period from 1931 through the late 1940s. It would prove very crucial in shaping both Accardo's future and the future of organized crime in Chicago. Frank Nitti took over as the front boss, but the real power was shifting. Paul Ricca, known as the Waiter, I think you're familiar with him, he became the true boss, and Accardo, his most trusted advisor, was right by his side. This was a master class in behind-the-scenes power. While other criminal organizations were having public power struggles, the Chicago outfit was quietly restructuring into a very modern criminal enterprise. Accardo understood something very crucial. The future wasn't in bootlegging or traditional rackets. He knew that would come to an end at some point. It was in legitimate business, in unions, in gambling, in entertainment. You know, my father always told me, he always said, Mike, we can do what we do on the street, but you gotta go legitimate. The future is in legitimate business. He knew that. He was smart enough. He passed it on to me. My dad wasn't really a good businessman, but he understood that the future was in legitimate business. Tony Accardo understood that too. He started pushing the organization toward these new ventures, always staying one step ahead of law enforcement. So important in that life. You gotta be a step ahead of them. I gotta tell you, the reason I was successful in the gas business, we were always one step ahead of them. They couldn't figure out what we were doing. We were anticipating what they were going to do to us, and we were able to beat them at their own game before they even affected us. By 1943, Accardo had become the outfit's enforcer boss, and by 1947, he was running the entire operation. This wasn't just a change in leadership, it was a complete modernization of how organized crime was going to operate in Chicago. Under Accardo's leadership, the outfit expanded into Las Vegas. We started to build Las Vegas, and yes, he was one of the key people involved in that. He revolutionized the gambling industry. They didn't just control the casinos, they built them. The Stardust, the Desert Inn, these weren't just gambling joints, they were legitimate business with legitimate owners. Accardo understood that the real money wasn't in running the games, it was in owning the house. How brilliant is that? So many mob guys, had they stayed in a legitimate world, they would have been very successful. Some of these guys are very smart, like Accardo. If they would have stayed and said, you know what, this isn't for me, I'm going legitimate. Unfortunately, they grew up on the streets and this is what they knew. They had that influence, but had they stayed legitimate, they would have done very well. During this period, Accardo also revolutionized how organized crime would handle internal disputes. He established what we called the Office, a formal system for resolving conflicts without violence. This wasn't just about keeping peace, it was about running crime like a business. The 1950s and early 1960s marked what many would consider the golden age of the Chicago outfit under Accardo's leadership. This is when everything came together. The legitimate businesses, the casino operations, the union control, the political connections, all came together. What made Accardo different was his corporate approach. He ran the outfit like a CEO runs a company. And yeah, it's organized crime. Remember, the reason we were able to thrive and prosper for well over 100 years was because we were organized. We had a system. We had a hierarchy. We had people that knew their place. We had political connections. We ran it like a company, without a doubt. Every operation had its budget, its projected returns, its risk assessment. He wasn't interested in glory or headlines. He was interested in profits and sustainability. Set him apart. Let me tell you something about Tony's home life during this period. He lived in a massive house in River Forest. He had legitimate tax returns. He belonged to country clubs. But unlike some of the bosses flaunted their wealth, Accardo maintained a very low profile. He understood that real power doesn't need to advertise. And again, what did he have in common with Carlo Gambino? Same thing. Worked in the shadows. You compare that to some of the guys that were out there. Even Joe Colombo, who was out there for a good reason. He was out there for the Italian-American Civil Rights League. He wanted to help Italian-Americans. John Gotti, we always have to put that. Was it a mistake? Of course it was. You can't be that outgoing. You can't be that much in the public eye. You can't thumb your nose in the face of law enforcement. They're going to get you. You got to remain in the shadows as best as you can. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, Accardo had effectively retired from day-to-day operations, but he remained the ultimate authority, what we call the chairman of the board. This period showed another side of his genius, and that was succession planning. He knew who he was going to put in place once he was gone. Unlike many other crime families that fell apart during leadership transitions, Accardo created a system that could outlast any individual. He understood that the key to longevity wasn't just in making money. It was in creating systems that can continue making money across generations. Isn't that what success is really all about? When you want to pass something on to your family, your kids, whatever, when you want your legacy to live on, you have to have a system in place. You have to have foresight. You have to have vision. And Tony Accardo, in our world, in his world, he had that. During this period, he focused on modernizing the outfit's operations, computer technology, offshore banking, international connections. Accardo made sure the organization stayed ahead of the curve. He wasn't just adapting to change, he was anticipating it, and that's a quality of any good leader. One of Accardo's most significant achievements was his development of political connections. Again, just like Frank Costello. You can't last on the street if you don't have political connections, people. And those that didn't have those connections, they didn't last. Unlike some bosses who bought politicians wholesale, Accardo created mutually beneficial relationships that stood the test of time. He understood that political power wasn't just about having friends in high places, it was about becoming part of the system itself. And under his leadership, the outfit didn't just influence politics, they became an unofficial branch of government in Chicago. Let me tell you something, even more so than New York or in any other city, in any other state in the country, Chicago was entwined in politics, the outfit there. And Accardo really did it. Capone tried to do it, but he was buying political help. He was buying police. Accardo, he made himself part of the system, that they had to rely on him. And even till today, Chicago is a town where there's influence from the street. Trust me on that. The genius was in subtlety, campaign contributions, legitimate business partnerships, union support. Everything looked clean on paper, but the influence was deep and lasting. Even till today, you can see the echoes of systems Accardo put in place, and he gets the credit for that. It wasn't Al Capone, it was all Accardo. Tony Accardo's final years were really a masterclass in criminal leadership. Even in, semi-retirement, he maintained control without ever appearing to be in charge. He lived to see his 86th birthday. He died peacefully in his bed in 1992, something almost unheard of in our world. Again, you look at Carlo Gambino. He died in 1976. He died peacefully in his home, did very, very little time in prison. Not even in prison. I think it was just jail time that he did. He and Accardo, they did it right. Until the end, Accardo remained sharp. He advised on major decisions. He maintained relationship he built over the decades. His last years show something very remarkable. A criminal leader who managed to stay both relevant and alive through multiple generations of change. You got to know how to navigate that life to last, to live it out, to not die in prison. You really got to know how to navigate that life. And you got to give a guy like Accardo credit, whether you like him or not, whether you call him a mob boss, a killer, whatever. You got to give him credit because he was really one of the kings at what he did. And you know what's most interesting about Accardo's final period is what didn't happen. No major prosecutions, no internal power struggles, no dramatic calls from grace. He died as he lived, managing everything from behind the scenes. And that was really, really an accomplishment. Tony Accardo's story represents something unique in the history of organized crime. It really did. The complete evolution from street thug to corporate boss. He wasn't just a criminal leader. You know, he was a very transformative figure who changed how organized crime operated in America in a big way. His legacy, it's complex. It's on one hand, he built one of the most effective criminal organizations in history. On the other hand, he corrupted systems that affect us to this very day. He showed both the heights of organizational genius and also the depths of moral compromise. As someone who lived in that world and chose to leave it, I can tell you this, Tony Accardo's story, it isn't just about crime. It's about power, it's about evolution, and the price of success at any cost. His methods were often wrong, but his insights into leadership and organizational management, they were undeniably right. The true lesson of Tony Accardo, I think it might be this: the same skills that can build a criminal empire could build a legitimate one. If we would have chosen the right way to go, we would have succeeded. A lot of smart guys in that life, no doubt. Accardo was one of them. The choice of how to use those skills, that's what defines a legacy. You know, we can learn a lot from Tony Accardo's life. Nobody should follow in his footsteps, of course, but look, you got to give him credit. He was good at what he did. He was probably one of the best in the history of organized crime. So that's it. That's the legacy of Tony Accardo. And my friends, before I go, I want to remind you, Franzese wine, I now have a wine branded in my name from the world's oldest vineyards. We have alcoholic wine, of course, non-alcoholic wine, huge seller now. And the taste is terrific, my friends, really. You're going to enjoy this family atmosphere, wherever you want. It's wonderful wine. You're going to enjoy the taste. You're going to love it. I guarantee it. So go to franzesewine.com before we sell out because it's moving fast. That's an offer, once again, you can't refuse with a taste you're going to love.